Welcome back to Speak English Podcast. I'm David.
And I'm Sarah. We're here to help you practice English in a fun and effective way.
That's right. And today, we have a really important topic, one that every English learner struggles with.
Let me guess. Forgetting new words?
Exactly. You learn a new word today, and by tomorrow, it's gone. Sounds familiar?
Oh, absolutely. It happens to everyone. But don't worry. We have some genius tricks to help you remember vocabulary fast.
And not just memorize, but actually use those words in real conversations.
These techniques are simple, effective, and backed by science.
So, if you're serious about improving your English, make sure to stay until the end.
And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss a new episode.
All right, let's get started. First, we need to understand why we forget words so easily. It's not just bad memory. There's a real reason behind it.
And once you know why, you can start fixing it. Ready? Let's go.
So, let's start by understanding why we forget new words so easily. You see, our brain is constantly filtering information. It decides what's important to keep and what can be erased. And unfortunately, new words often end up in the erase category because our brain thinks they're not useful enough. That's why you might remember a song lyric from years ago, but forget a new English word within hours. It's not about intelligence. It's about how your brain organizes information.
Exactly. And the reason this happens is something called the forgetting curve. This concept was discovered by a German psychologist, Hermann Ebbinghaus. He found that, without repetition, we forget about 50% of what we learn within an hour. And after a day, we forget almost 70%. That means if you don't reinforce new vocabulary, it will disappear very quickly. But the good news is, there are ways to trick your brain into remembering words for much longer. And that's what we're going to explore today.
That's right. If you want to remember new words, you need to make them stick. And the first trick is surprisingly simple. How you first learn a word makes a huge difference. If you just read it once in a textbook, your brain won't care. But if you interact with it in the right way, your brain will decide it's important enough to keep. And that brings us to our first technique, something called so. We just talked about why we forget words, and now let's move on to how we can stop that from happening. The key is something called active engagement. You see, if you just read a word once and move on, your brain won't think it's important. It's like meeting a person at a party and forgetting their name immediately because you never actually used it. But if you do something with the word, if you interact with it in a meaningful way, your brain sees it as valuable. And one of the best ways to engage with new vocabulary is to use it in a real sentence, right away. Imagine you learn the word astonishing. Instead of just repeating astonishing, 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 you could say, "The view from the mountain was astonishing. I felt like I was in a dream." That personal connection makes all the difference.
Exactly. When you take a word and apply it to your own life, your brain forms a deeper memory. It's the difference between passively hearing something and actively using it. Think about it. If you hear a song on the radio once, you might forget the lyrics. But if you sing along, suddenly they stick. The same happens with words. And here's another trick. Act out the word. If the word is gigantic, spread your arms wide while saying it. If it's whisper, actually whisper it. Your body reinforces the meaning, making it easier to recall later. And speaking of reinforcement, there's one method that works even better than using the word yourself, and that's teaching it to someone else.
So, we just said that actively using a word helps you remember it. But do you know what works even better? Teaching it to someone else. Think about it. When you explain something, your brain has to organize the information, simplify it, and find connections to make it clear. That's why teachers often say they learn more by teaching than by studying. Let's say you learn the word meticulous, which means being very careful with details. Instead of just memorizing it, try explaining it to a friend. You could say, meticulous means being super careful with every tiny detail, like an artist who spends hours perfecting every brush stroke. The moment you put a word into your own words, you're strengthening your memory. And the best part? You don't even need another person to teach it to.
That's right. You can actually teach yourself. One great trick is to pretend you're teaching an imaginary student. Imagine explaining the word as if you were a teacher standing in front of a classroom. You could say, "All right, class, today's word is resilient." It means being strong and recovering quickly. For example, after failing the test, she was resilient. She studied harder and passed the next time. When you do this, your brain processes the word on a deeper level. And if you really want to challenge yourself, ask questions like, "What's a good example of this word? How is it different from similar words?" It forces your brain to work harder, and that's exactly what helps information stick. But there's another technique that makes memorization even more powerful, and it has to do with something we all love: stories.
So, teaching is a great way to remember words, but there's something even more powerful: stories. Our brains are wired to remember stories much more than isolated facts. That's why you probably remember the plot of a movie you saw years ago, but you might struggle to recall a list of random words from last week's vocabulary lesson. Now, imagine this. Instead of memorizing the word serene, meaning calm and peaceful, you create a story around it. You picture yourself sitting by a quiet lake, the water completely still, the sky turning orange as the sun sets. Everything is silent. You feel completely relaxed, and then you say, "This place is so serene." By putting the word into a vivid scene, your brain connects the word with an experience, making it much easier to recall. But here's the real secret: your memory palace.
Exactly. A memory palace is an ancient technique where you store information in specific locations inside an imaginary place, usually a familiar one, like your house. Let's say you want to remember the word diligent, which means being hardworking and careful. You could imagine opening your front door and seeing a tiny worker bee buzzing around, carrying a clipboard, checking every detail, making sure everything is perfect. The bee is diligent. The next time you hear the word, your brain will instantly recall that little worker bee, making it almost impossible to forget. You can place different words in different rooms, creating a whole house full of vocabulary. And the best part? It works fast. You don't have to spend hours memorizing. You just create a scene, place it in a location, and your brain will do the rest. But let's take this a step further, because there's another trick that makes learning words even easier, and it's something we do every single day.
Now, let's talk about a strategy that everyone can use to remember words faster. Daily conversations. You might think that the best way to remember a word is to study it, but actually, one of the most powerful techniques is using new words in conversations right away. The more you hear and say a word, the more it becomes a part of your natural speech. So, instead of trying to memorize words in isolation, you should try to use them in context as much as possible. For instance, if you're learning the word determined, which means showing a lot of willpower or focus, try saying things like, "I am determined to finish this project today." Or, in a more casual situation, you can tell your friend, "I admire how determined you are to get things done." The point here is to make it a habit to use your new vocabulary in your day-to-day conversations. The more you practice speaking, the easier it becomes to recall these words when you need them. And it doesn't even have to be a big conversation. You can use them in short phrases, or even think to yourself during the day, "I feel so determined to finish this task."
And guess what? The best part is that you don't need to wait until you're in a real conversation with someone. You can practice by talking to yourself. I know it sounds a bit strange, But self-talk is incredibly effective for language learning. The more you speak the words out loud, the better your memory and pronunciation will become. It's like putting the word into practice without the pressure of a formal conversation. You can walk around your house, use a word in a sentence, and it will help you internalize it quickly. You don't need to be perfect, and you don't need a partner to practice with. This technique builds confidence and makes it easier to use new words when the right moment comes up. And remember, the more comfortable you get using these words naturally, the better you'll be at understanding and speaking them in real conversations. But there's still one more technique that's going to take your vocabulary to the next level, something that really boosts retention.
Now, let's move on to a technique that might sound a little unconventional, but is extremely powerful. Visualization. Imagine this. You're learning a new word. Let's say it's glimpse, which means a quick look at something. Instead of just reading the definition and moving on, you close your eyes and visualize what that word looks like. Picture someone glancing at something for a split second. Or imagine yourself catching a glimpse of something amazing, like a famous landmark or a celebrity walking by. This mental image helps to solidify the word in your mind. It creates a visual association that makes it easier to remember and recall the word later. The more vivid your image, the stronger the connection will be. It's like creating a little story in your mind that's connected to the word. And don't just do this for nouns. You can visualize actions too. For example, if you're learning the verb sprint, imagine yourself running at full speed down a track. The clearer the picture, the faster you'll remember the word.
I love this technique because it's like creating your own mental movie, and the brain is really good at remembering things when they're linked to images. Think of it as creating a mental movie trailer for each new word you learn. The next time you try to use the word in a conversation, you'll recall that mental image, and the word will come out naturally. It's much easier to remember something when your brain is seeing it rather than just hearing it or reading it. And, here's the thing, this technique doesn't just work for nouns or verbs. You can use it for adjectives, adverbs, and even expressions. Let's say you're learning the phrase at a crossroads, which means being at an important decision point in life. Visualize yourself standing at a literal crossroads with two paths, each leading to a different future. The more detailed your visualization, the more likely you are to remember the word when you need it.
Now, let's dive into some genius tricks to remember vocabulary faster. It's not about cramming words into your mind, but about using effective strategies that can help you retain them long term. One of the most powerful methods is the visualization technique. Imagine each word as a vivid image in your mind. The more detailed and creative the image, the stronger the memory. For example, if you're learning the word apple, picture a bright red apple with droplets of water on its surface, and even imagine the sound of it crunching when you bite into it. This technique works because your brain is much better at recalling images than abstract concepts. The more sensory details you add, the easier it will be to remember that word.
Yes, that's a fantastic trick, David. Another great method is using mnemonics. Mnemonics are memory aids that help you associate new words with something you already know. For instance, if you're trying to remember the word elaborate, you might create a sentence like, "Elephants love bananas and carrots," where each word starts with a letter from elaborate. It may sound a little silly, but these quirky connections can make the words stick in your memory. Mnemonics are especially effective because they help your brain make connections between new information and something already stored in your memory. The funnier or more unusual the mnemonic, the better it works.
Exactly, Sarah. And speaking of connections, another method is to group similar words together. Instead of learning random words, group them by category. For example, learn all the fruits first, then all the animals, and so on. This helps you create a mental map of related words. It's much easier to recall words when you know they belong to a specific group. Also, learning words in context, such as sentences or stories, helps reinforce the vocabulary in a more natural way. Instead of memorizing the word dog, try using it in a sentence like, "The dog is running in the park." This technique helps your brain see the word in action, which makes it easier to remember.
That's a great point, David. And don't forget the importance of repetition. Repetition is one of the most effective ways to reinforce your vocabulary. But here's the trick. It's not just about repeating the words over and over in isolation. You need to space out your repetitions. This technique is called spaced repetition, and it's proven to be incredibly effective for long-term retention. The idea is to review the word after a few minutes, then after a day, then after a week, and so on. This spaced-out review helps your brain to solidify the information in your long-term memory, so you're less likely to forget the words.
Exactly, Sarah. And here's another important point. When you're learning vocabulary, active recall is key. Instead of simply reading a word over and over, try to actively recall it from memory. For example, after you learn a new word, try to recall it without looking at your notes. You can even make flashcards and quiz yourself, trying to remember the meaning of the word or use it in a sentence. This method forces your brain to dig deep and retrieve the word from your memory, strengthening the neural connections that link the word to its meaning.
And don't forget to practice speaking the words out loud. Even if you're practicing by yourself, saying the words helps you solidify them in your memory. You can practice speaking in front of a mirror, or record yourself speaking the words, then listen to your recording. Hearing yourself speak the words helps you reinforce them in your mind, and it's also great practice for when you need to use them in conversation.
I love how these techniques are all about making the learning process fun and interactive. Remember, it's not just about memorizing vocabulary, it's about connecting with it on a deeper level. When you're engaged and using creative methods, vocabulary learning becomes not only easier, but also more enjoyable. And when learning becomes fun, you're more likely to stick with it and make real progress in your language skills.
Absolutely, David. And with all these tricks, you'll notice that your vocabulary starts to grow in no time. But remember, learning vocabulary is a marathon, not a sprint. Be patient with yourself and celebrate the small victories along the way. Now, let's move on to the next part, where we'll explore how to reinforce this vocabulary practice and make it a part of your daily routine.
Now that we've covered some powerful techniques for remembering vocabulary, let's talk about how to reinforce these skills in your daily routine. Consistency is key when it comes to language learning. You don't need to spend hours each day, but practicing every day for just a few minutes can make a huge difference. One great way to integrate vocabulary practice into your day is by setting small, manageable goals. For example, aim to learn 5 new words a day, and make it a habit to review them at the end of the day. Over time, those small efforts will add up, and you'll be surprised at how much you've learned.
Yes, David, small goals are definitely the way to go. And another great tip is to immerse yourself in the language as much as possible. Surrounding yourself with English will help reinforce the vocabulary you're learning. Listen to podcasts, watch TV shows, or read books in English. You don't have to understand every word, but the more you hear and see English in context, the better your brain will absorb the new vocabulary. This kind of immersion helps you naturally remember words without forcing it.
Great point, Sarah. Immersion works wonders. And another effective strategy is to practice with a partner or language group. This gives you the opportunity to use the new words in real conversations. When you actively use the vocabulary you've learned in speaking, your brain creates stronger connections with those words. Find a language buddy or a group where you can practice speaking and listening in English. It's not about being perfect, it's about practicing regularly and learning from mistakes.
That's such an important part of the process, David. Mistakes are actually a sign of progress. The more you speak, the more comfortable you become with using new vocabulary. And, of course, don't forget about writing. Writing sentences, short paragraphs, or even journaling in English helps reinforce vocabulary and grammar. Try writing about your day using the new words you've learned. Writing is a powerful tool for internalizing vocabulary and improving your overall language skills.
Absolutely. Writing helps solidify everything you've learned. And remember, consistency is everything. It's all about making learning a habit. Even if you only have 10 to 15 minutes a day, keep showing up and practicing. Over time, those small daily efforts will make a big impact on your language skills. So, take the time every day to review your words, use them in conversation, and immerse yourself in the language. The more consistent you are, the more natural English will become for you.
Exactly, David. It's important to remember that language learning is a marathon, not a sprint. You're building a foundation for long-term success, and the more you enjoy the process, the more motivated you'll be to keep going. Don't be too hard on yourself if you don't remember every word at once. Celebrate the small victories, like when you're able to use a new word in a conversation, or when you notice yourself remembering words more easily. These moments are proof of your progress.
Yes, those small victories matter. Keep celebrating them. And, as we mentioned earlier, reviewing and practicing every day is key. So, before we finish, we want to remind you to keep practicing with these vocabulary techniques. Whether it's through flashcards, reading, writing, or speaking, consistency is the secret ingredient. Don't worry about perfection. Focus on improvement and keep at it every day.
That's right. And with time, you'll find that your vocabulary grows naturally, and it'll feel more and more like second nature. Remember, you've got this. Keep building on what you've learned, and you'll continue making great progress in your English journey. And of course, if you ever need a refresher or new tips, don't forget to tune in to our podcast. We're here to help.
That's it for today's episode of Speak English Podcast. We hope you found these vocabulary tricks helpful and that you're feeling motivated to practice your English more effectively. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss out on our future episodes. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time with more tips to improve your English skills. Well, here we are at the end of today's episode. Before we wrap up, we want to take a moment to thank you for joining us. We know your time is valuable, and we're so glad you spent some of it with us today, learning how to remember vocabulary faster and more effectively. We hope these tips will make a huge difference in your English practice. But don't stop here. Learning English is an ongoing journey, and the more you commit to it, the better you'll become.
Absolutely, David. And that's why we want to remind you how important it is to keep coming back. By subscribing to the Speak English podcast, you're giving yourself a valuable resource for continuous improvement. We're dedicated to bringing you new tips, strategies, and insights every week. So, whether you're at home, on the go, or even practicing during your breaks, we'll be right here, supporting your English learning every step of the way.
Exactly. It's all about consistency and having the right tools and support. And subscribing to our podcast means you won't miss out on any of our future episodes. Trust us, each new episode will provide you with more opportunities to grow and practice. We're here to guide you, challenge you, and help you stay motivated.
And remember, by subscribing, you're not just keeping up with the latest tips and advice, you're making a commitment to yourself and your English goals. So go ahead and hit that subscribe button now. You'll be one step closer to reaching fluency and confidence in English, and we'll be here to cheer you on every step of the way.
So, with that, thanks again for listening to today's episode of the Speak English podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, keep practicing, and we'll see you next time with more amazing tips. Your English journey is just beginning, and we can't wait to continue supporting you on this exciting path. Take care, and see you soon.